Imagine a boy, no more than 15, torn from the streets of Rome, his name still warm on his mother's lips. Imagine the palace doors slamming shut behind him like the jaws of some gilded beast. Imagine the surgeons waiting in the marble corridor, their blades already wet with the blood of others who dared to be beautiful in Nero's sight. One cut. One scream swallowed by silk cushions. One childhood ended forever. The boy's name was Sporus, though few would remember it after that night. He was perhaps 14, perhaps 15, no one bothered to record the exact age of a pleasure slave once the emperor's eye had fallen on him. The sources disagree on whether he was a street performer, a household page, or simply one more beautiful face caught in the endless dragnet of imperial desire that swept through the markets and theaters of Rome. What matters is that he still had a boy's body, narrow shoulders, unbroken voice, the soft down along his jaw that had only just begun to darken. He still had a future, however faint, however precarious. He still belonged to himself. Then came the summons. Not a request, not an honor, but a death sentence delivered on perfumed parchment. The lictors arrived at dusk, their rods bundled like fasces of fate. His mother, if she still lived, would have clutched at their cloaks, offered every coin she had, fallen to her knees in the dust. It changed nothing. The palace gates opened the way a lion's mouth opens, and the boy was carried inside on a tide of purple silk and armored hands. The doors closed. The city outside kept breathing, laughing, selling figs and garlands under torchlight, as if nothing irrevocable had just happened to one of its children. Inside the Domus Aurea the air was thick with rose oil and terror. Sporus was stripped in a side chamber whose walls were painted with scenes of Ganymede's abduction, ironic, obscene frescoes that watched like silent witnesses. Slaves bathed him in milk, scraped his skin with streak-gills until it glowed, anointed him with spikenard worth more than his entire life had been valued at an hour earlier. They did not meet his eyes. They had done this before. Some of them had been him, once. The surgeons waited in the next room. They were Greeks, the best in the empire, men whose hands could set a gladiator's shattered bones or carve a statue so lifelike it seemed to breathe. Tonight their skill had a different purpose. Their knives were small, curved, warmed in braziers of glowing coal. The table was draped in imperial purple, as though the color itself could sanctify what was about to happen. Assistants stood ready with sponges, vinegar, styptic powders made from boiled boar's gall and spider webs. A priest of Isis muttered incantations under his breath, because even Nero's depravity liked the veneer of sacred ritual. They bound the boy's wrists and ankles with silk cords, soft, so they would leave no mark on the merchandise. A leather gag was forced between his teeth. Screaming was permitted in the palace, but not when it might disturb the emperor's dinner guests in the triclinium 2 halls away. Someone, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of habit, poured a cup of mandrake-laced wine down his throat. It dulled the edges, turned the world into a swimming nightmare of gold leaf and torch glare, but it did not erase the moment when the first blade kissed skin. The operation was called infibulation when it was done to athletes to preserve their wind, or simple castration when it was done to create eunuchs for the court. What Nero demanded was something more exquisite, more monstrous, the complete removal of everything that marked the boy as male, a surgical annihilation intended to leave the body smooth and ambiguous, a living blank canvas onto which the emperor could paint his dead wife. The surgeons worked quickly, expertly. Arteries were clamped with silver forceps forged for this single night. Flesh was folded, stitched, sculpted. Blood pooled dark and shining on the purple cloth, soaking through until it looked black in the lamplight. Sporus felt it all. The mandrake blurred the edges but could not reach the center of the fire. His body bucked against the silk cords, his muffled screams came out as wet, animal sounds that no one answered. Somewhere in the haze he understood that the pain was only the beginning. The real horror was what came after, the survival. The fact that he would wake up, that the heart hammering in his narrow chest would refuse to stop, that the empire would demand he go on breathing so that the game could continue. When it was finished they cauterized the wound with heated gold, Nero's personal touch, a brand of ownership seared into the raw flesh. They packed the ruin with frankincense and myrrh, as though embalming a corpse that had forgotten to die. Then they wrapped him in linen bandages soaked in honey and wine, carried him to a cushioned litter, and bore him deeper into the palace, toward the bridal suite where the emperor waited with the patience of a child about to unwrap a new toy. Outside, Rome slept under a late autumn moon. The Forum's statues kept their marble council. The Tiber flowed on, carrying the city's filth toward the sea. And somewhere in the labyrinth of the Golden House, a boy who had entered with a future left childhood behind forever, bleeding between his legs, while the most powerful man in the world rehearsed the words of a wedding vow no god would ever sanction. Power is never more naked than when it no longer needs to ask. In the year 66, in the glittering heart of the Domus Aurea, that truth took human form and was given the name Sporus. The emperor had murdered his pregnant wife Poppaea Sabina with a single, petulant kick to the belly. The official story was that she had died of a miscarriage. The palace slaves knew better. They had carried her broken body away while Nero wept theatrical tears and immediately began hunting for a replacement who would never talk back, never age, never swell with a child he did not want. He found the perfect material in a boy whose face, by cruel coincidence, resembled the dead empress when she had first caught his eye years before. One glance was enough. Desire and grief fused into a single molten command: make him her. What followed was not mere cruelty. Cruelty can be random, impulsive, human. This was colder, more absolute. It was the moment when power stops pretending to serve any law higher than itself and reveals its final nature, the ability to erase a person and write whatever it wishes on the blank space left behind. Sporus was not seduced, not bribed, not even raped in the ordinary sense. He was requisitioned. His body was state property the instant Nero's gaze settled on it, the way a sculptor claims a block of Parian marble or a general claims a province. Consent was not refused, it was never contemplated. The idea that a 14-year-old slave boy might possess something as quaint as bodily autonomy would have been laughable to every senator who later attended the wedding feast and raised their cups to the bride. That is what makes Sporus the perfect mirror. Look into it and you see power without mask, without apology, without limit. The surgeons who cut him did not act from personal hatred, they were simply the finest craftsmen available, the same men who restored damaged statues in the Forum. The slaves who dressed him in the stola and the flammeum did not torment him for sport, they followed the same protocols they used when preparing any imperial consort. The guests who toasted his health did not secretly gag behind their smiles, many genuinely admired the emperor's ingenuity. After all, lesser men had to content themselves with portraits or wax images of the dead. Nero had commissioned a living one. In that act, absolute power announced its creed: a human being is raw material. Gender, age, memory, future dreams, all can be edited the way a scribe corrects a faulty manuscript. The knife was only the first tool. The real instrument was the law itself, the entire machinery of the empire that woke up the next morning and accepted without protest that the emperor had married a eunuch boy dressed as his dead wife. No priest refused to perform the ceremony. No augur declared the omens unfavorable. No legionary on the Rhine or the Euphrates laid down his pilum in disgust. The world simply adjusted its definitions and moved on. This is why Sporus still matters. He is the place where the mask slips completely. Every despot since has worn finer disguises: ideology, progress, security, love, but the core transaction remains identical: I see, I want, I take, I remake. The difference is only in the elegance of the surgery and the sophistication of the propaganda. Nero was honest enough, or mad enough, to do it in broad daylight and call it marriage. Later tyrants would learn to hide the blood under paperwork, to replace the scalpel with forms printed in triplicate, to dress the mutilation in the language of rites or therapy or historical necessity. The outcome is the same: a human being walks in, a fantasy walks out, and everyone trained to look away does so with practiced ease. Sporus, then, is not an exotic footnote from a depraved reign. He is the control case, the laboratory proof of what happens when power is truly absolute and no one, not even the gods, is watching. He is the moment the emperor looks at a child and sees not a person but a solution to his grief. He is the living demonstration that the distance between beloved subject and my creation can be closed with a single imperial nod. And he is the silent, bandaged warning that once a society accepts that one person can be unmade and remade at the whim of another, the only remaining question is whose turn comes next. In the mirror of Sporus every empire sees its own reflection, stripped of purple rhetoric and golden ornament, and recognizes the face staring back. Rome in the year 66 was a city drunk on its own reflection. The Domus Aurea rose like a second sun over the charred ruins of the Great Fire, its walls plated with gold that caught the light and flung it back in blinding shards. In the streets below, fountains ran with wine on festival days, and the Circus Maximus shook with the roar of 250,000 voices chanting the emperor's name. Nero had turned the capital into a stage, and every citizen was both spectator and extra in the endless drama of his genius. Statues of him as Apollo crowned every colonnade, his verses were carved into temple pediments, his face gleamed on coins fresh from the mint, impossibly youthful, impossibly serene. The empire had never looked more radiant, more invincible, more blessed by the gods. Yet in the perfumed dark of the palace, a child was learning what all that radiance cost. While the plebs fought for scraps of bread and honey dormice thrown from imperial chariots, Sporus lay on a couch of citron wood and silver, legs pressed together against the throb of the fresh wound, staring at frescoes of Orpheus charming the beasts. The same artists who had painted those idyllic scenes had, only weeks earlier, watched the boy being carried past on a litter, blood darkening the sheets beneath him. They had returned to their scaffolds the next morning and gone on mixing vermilion and Egyptian blue as though nothing had happened. Beauty, in Nero's Rome, was required to continue smiling no matter what screamed behind the arras. At banquets the contrast became obscene. The triclinium blazed with 1,000 lamps, guests reclined on couches stuffed with rose petals that had to be replaced every hour so the perfume would not fade. Peacocks strutted between the tables with their tail feathers gilded, nightingales sang in golden cages suspended from the ceiling. In the center of it all sat the emperor, flushed with Falernian wine, one arm draped possessively around the shoulders of his new bride. Sporus wore the saffron veil of a Roman matron, the knots tied so tightly that every breath felt borrowed. His cheeks were rouged, his lips stained with mulberry, his eyelids dusted with malachite to make the eyes look larger, more mournfully Poppaea-like. When Nero laughed, the boy had to laugh too, a soft, practiced sound that never reached the eyes. Senators who had watched their own fathers proscribed and murdered now applauded the emperor's tenderness as he fed morsels of dormice and honey to the silent figure at his side. Courtiers who owed their fortunes to the whim of the same man who had kicked his pregnant wife to death now praised the delicacy of the bridal costume, the exquisite embroidery of pomegranates and ivy along the hem, symbols of fertility that mocked the ruined body beneath. The city that prided itself on gravitas and ancient virtue watched a eunuch boy dressed as the empress and called it love. Outside, the spectacle rolled on. Nero drove his chariot in the games, scattering gold to the crowds who screamed themselves hoarse with adulation. He sang on public stages while the elite pretended to weep at the beauty of his voice. He commissioned colossal statues and artificial lakes and rotating dining rooms that mimicked the turning of the heavens themselves. Rome had become the most magnificent theater in history, and the price of admission was the willingness to ignore the small, muffled sounds coming from the imperial apartments after the torches were extinguished. The contrast was never accidental. Nero understood, with the intuitive cruelty of the true artist, that the brighter the surface, the deeper the shadows could grow without anyone noticing. The more loudly the crowd cheered the god emperor, the more thoroughly they surrendered their right to look behind the curtain. Every golden tessera in the vaulted ceilings, every pearl sewn into the bridal veil, every peacock tongue served on silver platters was a coin pressed over the eyes of conscience. The city that bathed in light learned to be blind in the same places it was forced to see. So the empire looked at its reflection, gold, marble, music, glory, and saw only the sun god Apollo incarnate. It did not see the child with the stitched and bandaged groin being led on a golden chain through corridors that smelled of roses and terror. It did not hear the soft, animal whimper that escaped when the emperor's fingers dug too hard into a shoulder still thin enough to break. It did not notice that the most radiant chord in human memory had begun to rot from the inside, the way fruit ripens to bursting and then collapses into sweet decay while the skin still shines. Rome applauded its own magnificence, and in the applause it drowned the single, silent scream that should have shattered every mirror in the golden house, "Feel the knife." Not as a word, not as a historical datum, but as a living thing, cold Campanian steel warmed by the surgeon's palm, the edge so thin it drinks the lamplight and gives nothing back. Feel it slide between the boy's legs like a question no one ever thought to ask him. Feel the moment when skin parts, when the body that has carried him safely through 14 or 15 years of hunger and hope suddenly betrays him with a wet, intimate sound. The first cut is almost delicate, almost merciful in its precision, the second is not. The blade finds the root of him, severs tendon and vessel and future in one practiced stroke, and the scream that should follow is choked by leather and mandrake and the terrible knowledge that no one in the palace is listening for rescue. Feel the wedding veil afterward. It is saffron yellow, the color reserved for Roman brides on the morning they leave their childhood homes forever. The fabric is so sheer that torchlight passes through it like breath, yet when they lower it over his face it becomes a shroud. The weight is nothing, mere ounces of silk, but it presses down with the gravity of an empire. Beneath it his eyes are wide, pupils blown black with shock and opiate, lashes clumped with tears that taste of salt and frankincense. The veil clings to his rouged cheeks, drinks the sweat of fever, turns translucent where his breath fogs it from within. Every inhalation pulls the cloth against his lips like a lover's kiss he never asked for, every exhalation flutters it outward in a mockery of bridal shyness. Feel the sandals. They are delicate, impractical things meant for the sheltered feet of patrician women who never walk farther than from atrium to garden. The soles are thin kid leather dyed crimson, the straps woven gold thread that bites into the instep when he is forced to take the tiny, mincing steps required of a modest matron. His own feet, broad from running barefoot through the Sabura, scarred from broken pottery and dog bites, have been soaked and pumiced and painted until they look alien to him. When he stands, the bandages between his thighs pull and throb, fresh blood seeping through linen into silk. Each step is a negotiation with agony, too wide and the stitches tear, too slow and the imperial hand on his elbow tightens like a vice. He learns to glide as if floating, because floating is the only motion that keeps him from screaming aloud. Feel the weight of being owned. It is not the golden necklace shaped like a collar, though that is heavy enough, forged thick so it cannot be removed without the emperor's key. It is not the arm Nero drapes across his shoulders at banquets, fingers idly tracing the line where boy becomes doll. It is subtler, more suffocating, the knowledge that every breath he takes is borrowed, that his heartbeat continues only because it amuses someone else to listen to it. When courtiers bow to him as Domina or Lady Sabina, the words land like blows. When Nero kisses him in front of the entire court, the taste is wine and rotting roses and absolute possession. When the emperor falls asleep afterward, one arm flung across the boy's chest like a chain, Sporus lies staring at the painted ceiling and feels his own body as a foreign country that has been conquered, its borders redrawn, its name erased from the maps. Feel the paint on his face. The white lead cerussa is mixed with vinegar and rosewater, it dries to a porcelain mask that cracks if he dares to cry too hard. The kohl around his eyes is laced with antimony to make them gleam wetly, like Poppaea's on the day she died. The rouge on his cheeks is crushed beetle wings, the same crimson Rome uses to dye the cloaks of triumphant generals. Every morning slaves repaint him while he sits motionless, hands folded in his lap like a good wife, feeling the brushes move across his skin the way sculptors once moved chisels across marble, erasing, refining, perfecting someone who is no longer there. And beneath all of it, feel the silence. Not the absence of sound, the palace is never silent, but the deeper silence of a soul being hollowed out. The boy who entered those doors had a laugh that cracked on the high notes, a habit of kicking stones when he walked, a secret hope of buying his mother a little shop one day. All of that is gone now, cauterized as neatly as flesh. What remains is a vessel dressed in another woman's life, breathing through another woman's veil, bleeding through another woman's wedding gown. Feel it all at once, the knife, the veil, the sandals, the paint, the suffocating ownership, and understand that this is what it means to be made into someone else's living doll. The body survives. The scream does not, the question is small, almost weightless, yet it cuts deeper than any blade that touched Sporus's flesh. It is the kind of question a child asks when thunder rolls too close, will it happen to me, the kind a soldier whispers before the first charge, could this be the day the world ends, the kind every slave in every empire has swallowed like broken glass since the first chain was forged. What does it say about any society when the most powerful man alive can turn a living boy into a doll, and the world applauds? Listen for the silence that follows the asking. In that silence lies the real answer, nothing. It says nothing because the moment the applause begins, the question has already been murdered. The senators who lifted their cups to the bride were not monsters in private life. Many kept shrines to the household gods, kissed their own children goodnight, wept at funerals. The crowd that cheered Nero's chariot was the same crowd that once wept for murdered kings and toppled tyrants. Yet when the emperor paraded his mutilated replacement wife through the streets in a gilded carriage, garlands rained down like spring blossoms. The machinery of consent, polite, perfumed, lethal, hummed so smoothly that no one even pretended to be shocked. That is the terror Sporus carries into every century after his own, not that evil men do evil, but that ordinary cities, ordinary centuries, ordinary audiences will watch a child be unmade and call it entertainment, or progress, or love, or security, or historical necessity. The knife changes shape, scalpel, syringe, camera, contract, uniform. The wedding veil becomes a school uniform or a bridal dress or a patient gown or a social media filter, but the transaction remains identical. One person decides what another person must become, and everyone else adjusts their vision until the victim disappears inside the costume. We tell ourselves distance protects us. That was Rome. That was Nero. That was 2,000 years ago. We have laws now, human rights charters, viral videos, international tribunals. Yet every year another child is trafficked, another prisoner is disappeared, another identity is erased by decree or doctrine or diagnosis, and the applause still comes, sometimes thunderous, sometimes merely the quiet click of like, the soft rustle of turning the page, the collective exhale of relief that it was someone else this time. The empire learns new languages, but it never forgets the grammar of possession. The question is a blade held to the throat of every era that believes itself civilized. It asks whether the difference between a palace eunuch in saffron silk and a modern child stripped of name, gender, future, or freedom is anything more than better lighting and smoother propaganda. It asks why the crowd that would burn a tyrant in effigy one year will cue the next to take selfies with his successor. It asks how thin the ice beneath our feet truly is, and whether the warmth we feel is sunlight or the glow of a funeral pyre we mistake for dawn. Sporus never spoke the question aloud. The gag, the veil, the paint, the terror took care of that. But he carried it in his eyes every time he was led into the banqueting hall, every time Nero's hand rested on the back of his neck like a collar. It lived in the tiny flinch no amount of training could erase, in the way his painted smile never quite reached the place where a boy used to live. He carried it through every province Nero dragged him to, Greece, Naples, the length of the Via Appia, a walking indictment no one dared read. And he carries it still. Every time a society decides that some bodies are raw material, that some griefs are too important to be borne without replacement parts, that some fantasies deserve living tributes, Sporus steps out of the shadows in his blood-stained wedding dress and places the question against the collective throat like a cold, steady blade. The applause falters for a fraction of a heartbeat. The golden lamps flicker. The emperor's hand tightens. Then the music swells again, the cups are raised, the cameras flash, and the moment passes. But the question remains, patient as stone, sharp as the surgeon's knife, waiting for the next empire to answer it honestly. So far, none ever has.